Hello there. Welcome to Celebrate Southern Africa. My name is Dawn Denton, and I have a guest. It's now for the third time, Treive, that we're speaking on Facebook Live. Um, the first time we chatted was last year, so just about a year ago,
Mm.
during the book festival in 2022. And then yesterday, I had the pleasure of Treve interviewing me, which was an unusual experience for me, but it was great fun. So pop over and have a look on the Facebook page if you haven't seen that, or you can go to YouTube. And of course, if you do subscribe to podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast, you can also have a listen there. So today, Treve, I am so excited to share your story about your journey because I can relate to so much of it. So this time last year, you had just launched A Nun and the Pig. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, good morning, Dawn. And it's a pleasure to be back talking to you again. And now the tables have turned, aren't they? You're interviewing me rather than the other way around. So yes, about a year ago, I was just flattered that Amberley Publishing published my book, A Nun and the Pig, Travels in South Africa, Tales from South Africa, which was about my work in South Africa in the 1980s. And I was in the world of publishing, and I was in my local bookshops signing. And then I was really delighted that Jonathan Ball, the publisher in South Africa, also took on the book and released it in South Africa, which was just amazing. And the next thing I knew, that the January 21, I was 21, or I've lost track, 22, January 22, I was in Cape Town doing book signings, and introducing the book to the good people of South Africa, which was quite a moment. You think about when you start these things, just opening a laptop and writing those first words. You never for 1 minute think that you're actually going to perhaps end up in a bookshop with people wanting to speak to you and the like. So that was just really exciting, and I got to speak on Cape Talk Radio. I don't know any listeners are familiar with Cape Talk, but it's a sort of possibly South Africa's equivalent to Radio 4, and it was the evening section. So yeah, I was very flattered to be interviewed and meet lots of people and talk about the book.
What's really interesting about writing a book is for some people, it's just about getting started and then writing the book. And then they feel like, okay, now I've done that, I can tick the box. But actually, the journey just begins because what it does is it opens up other opportunities without you even realizing it. So, of course, the beginning of that was the book signing and connecting with other, marketing people like radio. But you fell in love with the history of the Eastern Cape and you stumbled across a couple of other things that really sparked your interest and has led you on another journey. So what was it that planted the seed for this next step of the journey?
Yes, well put. Another journey. That's actually how it feels. I don't know any other people who've written books or they've not written books, but they do become journeys. You sometimes start off with these fledgling ideas, or you have a curiosity, and then sometimes it can grow. And the next thing you know, you're at the dinner table with your family, and they're saying, why aren't you paying attention? And you're actually absorbed thinking about your journey. Yes, I'd finished a Nun and the Pig, and during the course of it, I've been reading about Xhosa history and colonial history in the Cape. And I stumbled across this most amazing story, which I just couldn't stop thinking about. I mean, I'm British, I'm from the UK, and we have these amazingly big stories, Shakespearean stories, or we have stories about Henry VIII, or the murder of the princes in the Tower. These are large, huge, expansive stories. And then I came across one about a teenage girl in the Eastern Cape. And the story in simple terms was that she, alleged to have killed 40,000 of her own tribal group during the 1850s. And I couldn't believe it. And so I started to do more reading, and it's called part of what's called the Great Cattle Killing of 1856 to 1857. And at the heart of it, it's alleged that a teenage girl precipitated this and caused the mass breakdown of the local tribal group, displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, So I was started to order books and academic papers from all over the world. And my poor wife said, "Why are you so interested in this story?" I said, "Because she's being blamed for this tragedy, but I don't actually think she's the principal cause. She has been made responsible, given the blame for it." So when I went to Cape Town to launch A Nun and the Pig, I then scooted off up to the Eastern Cape, and I met up with some history buffs, part of the Cape Border History Society, and I went off to explore this story even more to see if I could get to the heart of it. And instead of reading about what's called the Great Cattle Killing in academic books, I actually went and stood where the events happened. I stood in the village where the girl had lived. I went and found her grave. And all these things really brought the story to life. And I started to sort of formulate a view. But I had to get out of South Africa because COVID was about to start. So that was the first time. And the second time, yeah, I needed to get back home to follow some of
But
the
I find because that's so growing up in apartheid South Africa, for me, a lot of our history was more about the European settlers and the white South Africans and their journey. We heard the odd story about the Battle of Blood River, and we heard, but it wasn't prominent in our history. And so for me, this is just it's a story I'd heard of the cattle, this cattle killing and this period, but also I did history at university level. So I presume it probably crept in there as a little bit of an overview. And I think that there's so much more that we can discover, because remember, these communities didn't have a way of documenting what was happening. It was just folklore at the time. So the stories we need to really delve a bit deeper into, explore. But I'm also wondering if there is something about you being British that investigating something like this, because it is an investigation, is without the emotional baggage that we would bring as South Africans and our prejudices, our experiences. And I'm wondering if there's because of your lack of connection to that, it's given you a different impetus in your research.
Yeah, Donna, and I think you've touched on something. It is a hugely sensitive subject.
Yeah.
The young lady called Nongqawuse, and the cattle killing is sensitive, and people are either having very entrenched views, or people are shy to talk about it because they're quite embarrassed because it doesn't reflect well. But I suppose I've come at it, and I'm trained as a scientist. My background is in biology and chemistry, and so I'd like to think when I'm faced with a situation, I try and unpeel it, try to get to the bottom and understand the facts in order to come to a conclusion. And that's what I tried to do, I think, with my work on the cattle killing and this young lady, which is why I actually particularly went to the sites to see it for myself. I was reading the academic text, I was reading the books, but I wanted to strip that away and actually go and stand where the events happened. Because when you say that a teenage girl caused the death of 40,000 people, it is beyond belief. But then when you get into the narrative, when you get to understand, well, I've then begun to realize, in fact, it wasn't necessarily her responsibility, although she's blamed. I also began to realize that it was almost inevitable that this event was going to happen. If you understand the background, if you understand the history, if you understand the culture of the Xhosa people, and if you understand the colonial pressures at the time and the circumstances, a tragedy of this magnitude had been on the cards for several decades. And there were a number of other events going on: the loss of King Xhosa, the loss of the lands in the Eastern Cape, which was putting enormous pressure on the indigenous population. And a calamity like this was almost, I say, but it's inevitable. But I did try and treat it like a bit of detective work. And the book that I've subsequently written, called The Girl That Killed a Nation, I actually lay out the different interpretations of it. Some Xhosa people say it was the fault of the governor, Sir George Grey. Other people say it was the fault of the chiefs who were irresponsible. Some lay it squarely at the feet of the teenage girl. So I try and lay out the different interpretations and try and explain why these things happen. Just one of the things, Dawn, that was particularly exciting. So if we say a young teenage girl might have had visions while tending to the crops near a river on the wild coast, it all sounds a little fanciful. But if you go down to that beautiful valley, that beautiful river, it's quite fantastical. I always say I come from sort of Cornish stock. We're pretty earthy, and we don't have many visions in Cornish culture. But if I was going to have a vision, that's where I would have it. It was just a wonderful place, and I could see, oh my goodness, if you believed in the ancestors, if you believed in a different way of looking at life, then down in the valley with that wonderful scenery, the Indian Ocean crashing on the shore, cattle in the background, palm trees, and the various acacia trees, I suspect other people would be quite moved by it.
There seems to be a bit of a Joan of Arc parallel.
Ah, well, there you go. Well, this is when you read the books. So in Xhosa tradition, the young lady called Nongqawuse is actually vilified, and it's an insult, and it's to call it something. If you've got a problem or something's going badly wrong, you might even say, "Oh, it's a Nongqawuse problem or situation." But one interpretation actually was that she was a leader, a young woman that was standing up to the pressures that were mounting in the mid 1800s. And her approach was to say, well, we kill all the cattle, we'll drive all the Europeans into the sea, which sounds, where we're sitting today, a little bit fanciful. But in the mid 1800s, that wasn't. And so she was actually trying to tackle the huge pressures of the onslaught of colonialism in a way that was consistent with their traditions. And some people today compare her with Greta Thunberg or Joan of Arc as young women in male and patriarchal societies who are taking unconventional approaches to tackle what was a huge amount of pressure on their society.
I love that, and I love the being in for her in a very unusual circumstance and being the unusual thinker. And I think that's being really brave as well. So I think you're doing her a really good service by telling her story and giving all sides of it as well. Now, one of the things about research, I think, is that often it feels quite a lonely time because you do have to spend a lot of time plowing through books, picking up on detail, and thankfully using the scientific approach that you're using, because otherwise you can get wrapped up in some of the fancifulness of some of these historic stories. But you have found that connecting with others through your research has given you another level completely, and given you fantastic interpretation and more knowledge that you probably wouldn't have access to by connecting with people who have the same passion.
You're absolutely right, Dawn, particularly during COVID and afterwards. I'm here in the UK studying a period of history based on the Eastern Cape. So it does feel, honestly, it does feel very lonely. Or I like to talk with people about problems to just try and solve them. So I managed to make contact with what's called the Border History Society, based in the Eastern Cape, and I found a similar group of I was going to call us nuts and nerds, but that's not quite right.
I think they'll be proud of that title, to be fair.
An eclectic bunch of historians who have a fabulous in-depth knowledge of Xhosa history in the Eastern Cape. And to cut a long story short, I made contact with them, and then a few weeks later, I had never met these guys before. I ended up staying in their house, and then we ended up forming a couple of what they call vakashas, which is a Xhosa word for expedition. And we went off into the bush in a 4x4, nearly getting swept away in rivers, getting lost. We went and found the grave of the young lady that I was talking about, the prophetess, which was quite something. So I went and found that in the middle of a field near Alexandria, and we went and found the grave of a famous king called King Xhosa, who was killed at the hands of a gentleman called Harry Smith in 1835. I mean, that just as an example, that Google said to get to his grave should have taken about 3.5 hours. It ended up taking us 2.5 days. But we did have the weather against us, and we did end up in Pondo land. So I've exaggerated slightly, but the first day we couldn't get to it. We drove within 1 kilometer of it, but the roads were so atrocious, the rivers were flooding. But your point is, meeting with people, working with other people, we're able to bounce off each other. And taking the example of the death of King Xhosa, I actually held an outdoor court. So we arrived at where he had died in 12th of May 1835, and I explored. I literally ran down the hill where the king had spent his last few minutes running away from the British troops, and then I held an outdoor court with my colleagues and saying, what do we think? Was this murder or was it not murder of the king? And it sort of brought history alive. It wasn't stuffy. Again, we weren't in books. We were people sharing our knowledge, challenging each other, a bit like a judge and jury, and trying to ascertain what had happened on that day. So during the course of that work, working, exploring, I came across a British soldier called Harry Smith. And wherever I was going in the Eastern Cape, this name kept popping up. And he was a very, very famous British soldier. Anyone that's familiar with South Africa might be aware of a town called Ladysmith, and there are Harry Smiths also as towns. And these are named after who was a gentleman who was called Sir Harry Smith and Lady Smith, who in the middle of the 1800s had almost rock star status in Victorian Britain. They went to dinner with the Queen. They were lauded by the Duke of Wellington. But I got to see Harry Smith's work in Africa and in Southern Africa, and his interaction with the indigenous tribes, and some of the difficulties that he caused. Anyway,
did you like him when you were researching him? Did you like him? Because there's characters that you research and you go, yeah, not.
Okay, so it's a good question. No, I can't. No, I didn't like him. I tried to be dispassionate and unemotional, but when you've got his autobiography, when you've got his biography, and when you're reading day after day, and when you've been to places, I didn't warm to him. Sorry, but it's very hard. The other thing I've got to accept. I'm a 21st century British person living in a warm house in the UK, and I'm imposing 21st century values on events that are happening in the 19th century. But that said and done, he was a product of the Victorian period, but I didn't naturally warm to him. But I was interested in him because he had a huge effect on the history of the Eastern Cape, and he was a rock star in Victorian Britain. When he came back from some of his trips away, certainly in the 1840s, the bands were striking up when he went to town. Wow. The streets were lined, and as I say, the Queen wanted to dine with him. So Harry Smith was quite a character, but not on my birthday card.
So you explored his journey as part of the Eastern Cape, and then and it led you further afield. But you also came back with a couple of illnesses from Africa, and I'd like to apologize on behalf of the continent for making you ill.
Dawn, I know I've worked and traveled in Africa many times, and I know some of the golden rules, which is don't really swim in rivers, don't wash your hands in ditches. Make sure that you sometimes wear long trousers, particularly in long grass. I know the rules. I broke the rules. I came home from traveling around extensively, and to cut a long story short, within 48 hours of coming home from South Africa, I was in the accident and emergency ward of Winchester Hospital, and then in the isolation ward with 4 tropical diseases. Um, so I wasn't feeling particularly well. I did apologize for being there, but they said I needed to be there, and they were relieved to have a patient that wasn't suffering a broken ankle or COVID.
I think what we're getting from you, Treve, is the fact that when you put your heart and mind to something, you go all out and you don't hold back.
And also, I'm fascinated with the Eastern Cape. You can't hold me. I used to work there sort of 43 years ago, and I just think it is absolutely astounding. And I think the history is, yes, yes, I'm not very restrained. And one good friend of mine said, "Did you want to swim?" Golden rules in Africa. Another rule is never swim in the river mouth in near the Indian Ocean. It's not a safe place. I went swimming across the river mouth in the Indian Ocean, but I can't. I've got to suffer the consequences. If you end up then in hospital, well, you've only got yourself to blame. But
But
the
what I love about your story is that you come home, you've got all your research, you start thinking about now you've been ill, so it's put a bit of hold onto it, and you spend some time with friends and family, and you kind of wander into the Winchester Cathedral, where you've been a lot of times, and something else takes you on another journey.
So after being in hospital, I thought my research and my journey exploring the history of the Eastern Cape was coming to a natural conclusion, and that I was in a position to start writing my second book, The Girl Who Killed a Nation. Only to find that when I went into Winchester Cathedral, a friend pointed out a plaque on the wall which had the name of Sir Harry Smith on it, the man whose exploits and activities I'd been following in the Eastern Cape. He was there in the entrance. Now, as anyone listening to this can tell you, probably discern, I'm not short of a few words. I'm not a quiet chap, but I was absolutely flabbergasted to see his name on a roll of honor in the local cathedral. So the next thing I did, I realized that I went to the local army barracks museum, and guess whose portrait was on the wall? Sir Harry Smith. It was like that. There's a famous phrase I've read once: "Fate goes ever as fate must." It's from the book of Beowulf by Seamus Heaney, or interpretation by Seamus Heaney. And I thought, this is fate. I've been out looking at indigenous history in Southern Africa, and here I am bumping into Sir Harry Smith. And I went into the museum, looked at his portrait, and his portrait talked back to me and said, "I wondered when you were going to turn up." And I turned round to him and said, "You might look fine in all your regalia in that portrait, but I know some of your dirty secrets." And then I made a decision that I needed to go and explore the life of Sir Harry Smith a little more. And we came from a town called Whittlesea in Cambridgeshire. I contacted the local church where his bust was on the wall, where he went to school. And I went to see where he was born. I went to the church where he was educated. And then I ended up at the grave of Sir Harry Smith and Lady Smith, tucked away at the back of a large graveyard, and reflected on the fact that I'd seen the grave of King Hintsa, I'd seen the grave of Nongqawuse, and now I saw the grave of Sir Harry Smith. And all three of them have greatly influenced the history of the Cape, but all of them were what I call worm fodder now. And just how yes, he didn't. Yes, it's not like he had a huge mausoleum in Westminster Abbey. He was tucked away at the back of a graveyard. But
And
the journey felt as it had come to a natural conclusion. Not a journey that I had deliberately planned to go as it did, but just as fate goes ever, as fate must.
how do you feel about him now that you've done a bit more digging into the man he is or was?
I think it's part of the problem is I don't particularly like Harry Smith, but what I struggle with, he was very much a product of the Victorian period. I
Yeah.
mean, he literally was a model Victorian, going out fighting for king and queen and empire, and he was ruthless in his pursuit of what he was needed to achieve as an army officer.
Mm.
He suffered that hideous quality, hubris. The power went to his head. And so the way he conducted himself was really, how do I put it? It was really rather very distasteful. What I struggle with is the way he treated some of the chiefs, or many of the chiefs in the Eastern Cape in the mid 1800s, was very disrespectful. He didn't just rule them; he humiliated them,
Mm.
and that's hubris is not a good quality. And then some people would say that he was responsible for the death of the most powerful king in the Eastern Cape. But I am aware that others would say he was a British Army officer doing his job and executing it, and was recognised and adored by Victoria and Wellington.
I mean,
So
he could have also been one of those that broke the mold, because as we see, there are people who break the mold in your stories. But again, at what cost in those days would that have been?
he did not. He was not a mold breaker. He was what you would say an exemplar of a British Army officer in mid 1800s, and he was going off putting down rebellions and putting the indigenous population in place so that they could be ruled from London or by the local governor. That's what he was there to do.
There's of course the very controversial movement now to go back into history and change place names and remove statues. And what are your views really on that? Because that's a tricky one when we look at, I mean, Harry Smith is a town in South Africa, Ladysmith is a town in South Africa. What would you feel about those place names?
Well, let's take a good example. I'm going to take Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. Okay, so Grahamstown is a major town with a wonderful university and an enormous history, particularly in the 18th and 18th century, related to, sorry, in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, which is now called Makanda. So that's the official name of Grahamstown. Grahamstown was originally named after a British administrator or army official. Makanda might not mean much to many people, particularly if you're from of European heritage. But Makanda is actually a hugely significant name. It's the name of a prophet who died in 1820 called Makanda Mphele. And he was one of the chief leaders of the frontier wars in the early part of the 19th century. So at a surface, for Europeans, particularly modern day, might look at it and say, why are we calling it Makanda? It doesn't mean anything. It's Grahamstown is what it's been called for decades. Makanda, what does that mean? Well, for the indigenous population, the Xhosa, Makanda means a whole lot. This was another prophet who was leading the Xhosa against the Europeans. So if you just take a different perspective, it has very, 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 very strong meaning. It's not just Makanda, it's Makanda Mphele, the left-handed one, the one who led an uprising and nearly took, and many Xhosa people believe that Makanda Mphele will actually return one day. So I hope that...
So deeply spiritual as well, so deeply spiritual.
Yeah. Although one of the good things about some of the new names is you have to get you around some of the Xhosa. So
you're way better than I am. I'm a Joburg girl. I'm known as a Vali over the river, the Vaal River. So that's not my. You're doing much better than I would in the Eastern Cape. So now, what is the journey now with your writing? What's happening with The Girl Who Killed a Nation and with Harry Smith?
Okay, so I think me and Harry are going to part company for a while. There's only so much of hubris-laden Victorian soldiers I can put up with. But I've written a book. So it's The Girl That Killed a Nation. It tells the story of Nongqawuse and the cattle killing, and it follows my adventures in the Cape. I've written that up, and I've submitted that to publishers to see if there's some interest. I deeply want to get this story out. I started our little conversation by saying, certainly here in the UK, we're familiar with Shakespeare, we're familiar with Henry VIII and all that sort of stuff, and those huge stories. But I just want this huge story, this African story, to be told, because it's almost unbelievable. You know, when I tell it, some people think I'm making it up. I said, no, it's factually true. And the other fascinating thing is it's got these so many different ways of interpreting it. So I'm waiting to hear back from publishers, and I'm hoping that we can get it into print. And I've tried to write it in a very easy format so that it's accessible to a lot of people, hasn't got references, and I talk about my particular journey. So when I talk about where these events happen, you come and stand with me, and you can see, and as I may have mentioned, that I actually end up standing at the grave of the young woman that I'm talking about, the prophetess, and you know, you can actually feel and find out how her life was concluded. So I'm waiting to see. I've got that waiting game, waiting to see. I've sent out the manuscripts, and let's see what happens.
And once, because we've spoken about this before, is once this project is finished, have you got something lined up, or are you going to take a break and let the universe direct you?
You're very naughty, Dawn. I've got next to me a list of to-do things, and everything on the to-do list can be answer some important emails, or cut the lawn, or take the car to be serviced. But
You can't, it's been raining for too long. I can't get my lawn cut either.
But it's also got another page with, and I think I just call it big ideas, and that's where I put down some of them. If I could get The Girl Who Killed a Nation published, I would love to go on another vakasha, starting at the north of the Wild Coast and working my way all the way down to just before East London. Because the Wild Coast, well, the clue's in the name, it's wild. And you can tell the stories of mineral exploitation, the wonderful wildlife, the geology, the Xhosa history. It's the home of some of the world's best Dachau weed. It's near where Mr. Mandela and Winnie Mandela lived. So I could travel along and tell these various stories along the sort of 250 kilometers. So yes, I've got that in mind. I haven't told my wife yet, but she knows when I'm brewing something up. But
So anyone listening or watching, please don't tell Mrs. Nicholas.
And if you want to come with me on the journey, let me know. I'm thinking of sort of doing different legs of the journey with different people, and seeing how it goes.
Oh, I am so thrilled that you got to chat to us again. And also, I think this is a remarkable story. And, you know, I almost feel guilty that we don't know it, you know, and I feel like we have been cheated. Growing up in apartheid South Africa, we were cheated of the reality of our land in so many ways. And I just want to thank you for opening our eyes to something that's really very important, not only to our country, but to our future, because understanding the past means that we understand the future better, doesn't it?
Well, perhaps I couldn't agree more. To understand the future, you've got to have your roots. It was all grounded in the past to understand where you've come from. So perhaps if I can get this published, we could come back again and we could talk about it, and I could share more about the story, and hopefully you'll have had a chance to see what this what the story is really all about, and you can make your own judgment about what happened and why.
I'm really looking forward to that. And thank you so much for chatting to us and sharing your amazing journey, and even letting Harry Smith in on that for a time period. It seems like he's just getting involved even in the present. Like, leave us alone.
Yes, that's very true.
Thank you very much, Treive, and best of luck. And please do come back when you're ready to tell us more.
Thanks, Dawn. Take care.
Bye-bye.